So which type of isometric contractions do I use the most with advanced athletes? So, there's two main types of isometric contractions. So you have what's called yielding isometrics, which is when you're pausing isometrically against resistance. Against gravity. And then you have overcoming isometric, when you're pausing isometrically against resistance. So both of these isometric contractions can be very useful with high-level athletes. But although they're both isometric contractions, they both can serve different purpose and different time points of the off-season training. So for example, earlier on, if I'm using an isometric contraction and one of my goal, along with some increase in strength, is also to improve hypertrophy, then yielding isometric can be beneficial, especially if you're doing these isometric contractions in the eccentric phase of the movement, because now you're prolonging the time you're spending through your isometric contractions, which can build or lead to more muscle fiber breakdown, which can be beneficial for hypertrophy. Now, as the goals become more strength oriented, I find you have more benefits doing overcoming isometric, specifically the functional isometric technique or the isometronic technique. So the functional isometric technique, which is my personal favorite when it comes to overcoming isometric, you choose an angle that's that means something for the sport. Okay, so for most team sport, if we're talking about the squat, you would choose maybe a top range, so top third type range of motion, where you would do your isometric contractions at the top third, which is a little bit more relevant angle wise to most team sport actions. So what you do at this point, you might do 4 or 5, maybe 6 reps, where you're pausing against the top pins, or you're pressing against the top pins as hard as you can, as if you're trying to break through these top pins. But obviously, because the pins are there, there's no movement, hence the isometric contraction. But because you're trying to create more and more tension through the pins on a 6 to 8 second isometric contractions, what happens is intramuscular tension increases tremendously, which allows you to tap in more motor units than you would normally. So this can be beneficial later on to increase or improve strength barriers at that specific angle. So that can be quite useful. Then the functional isometric, it's kind of like the same concept, but instead of doing a 6 to 8 isometric contractions on every rep, what happens is you do 6 dynamic reps through a short range of motion on a 1-0-1-0 tempo. And then on the 6th rep, you pause isometrically for 6 to 8 seconds, as hard as you can through the pins. And then you go back down to the bottom pins, and then you try to touch the top pin again for a 7th rep. And what happens here is if you touch the top pin on the 7th rep, it means that you can go up in weight. Now, the functional isometric, typically you're going to use about 50% of your 1RM to do these sets. So the main difference, aside the fact that we're going for multiple isometric contractions of 6 to 8 on the functional isometric and one isometric contraction of 6 to 8 on the isometronic, the main difference is functional isometric at 50%. So it's you pressing against the pins that's creating most of the tension. While the isometronic, you try to go as heavy as you can on that isometric contraction, but the difference is you're combining dynamic with isometric followed by dynamic contraction. So it's a little twist. It's still a form of functional isometric. It's just a little bit more advanced because you're combining 2 types of muscle action during your set. But both of these, for me, with high-level athletes, are by far my favorite. How would I program for an athlete who has an uncertain end date for their competitive season? So an athlete that you need to train during the off season, but you don't really know when the season will start. To me, with these situations, the best option is a conjugate sequencing adaptation. So kind of like the West Side conjugate concept, where you're training maximal strength on one day, and you're training either dynamic effort or repeated effort on another day on the same body parts. That to me would be the smartest, because since you don't really know, you can't really afford to specialize on one thing and then miss out on. So let's say you're specializing on, I don't know, like explosive strength, and in your mind you're going to keep progressing through the speed strength continuum through the off season, but now all of a sudden, without you knowing, in a week the season start. So then you didn't really go through your complete progression. So then the athlete is kind of like a little bit, you've taken out a little bit of his potential, because you didn't really train all the qualities that needed to be trained for him to peak properly for the sport. So by using the West Side modified conjugate method, at least it allows you to train the heavy strength range of the continuum and the faster range of the continuum at the same time. So the thing is, you might not reach the same peaks on each qualities, but at least you're always going to be training these, so there won't be any drastic detraining. Although you're still improving these qualities, there won't be any drastic detraining of qualities that could be beneficial for the event, but that you can't really time properly because you have no idea of when it starts. So that's what I would do in a situation like this. So can I describe the critical drop-off point? So what that means. So the critical drop-off point, so for strength, for example, so let's say you're training for strength. If you're training purely for relative strength, the critical drop-off point is about 7%. So what that means is, if you're training, you're doing, let's say, incline press at 100 kilos, and then you're doing sets of 6 at 100, sets of 3 at 100, 100 for 3, 100 for 3, 100 for 3, and everything is going well, but then after a few sets, all of a sudden, you have a rep drop-off, or if you want to maintain the same weight, you're so fatigued that you have no choice but to decrease the load in order for you to keep going on with your 3 reps. So that's a drop-off that we call. But then there's a critical drop-off point in which you don't want to get below. And that is, for strength, it's 7%. So if you get to a point where you're using 100 for 3, and then you keep on going, and the only way you can do 3 is by using 90, then you've passed, you've busted that 7% drop off. You're above 7%. So now what happens is, neurally speaking, it becomes inefficient training. It becomes like quantity over quality. But now the goal with training is you always want to have quality reps, which is why you need to account for the critical drop-off. It's okay to keep training that quality as long as you're within that 7%, but as soon as you have to go past that 7%, now the work you're doing becomes non-specific to the task you're trying to improve, and it becomes garbage mileage. So that's one good way to monitor training volume if you want. So for example, I would do the same thing with professional athletes with track work. So let's say we had phases where we wanted to improve speed. So then let's say you're running like 50 meters and you have your athletes clock in a certain time. So, and on set 1, and that's his fastest time because he's fresh. He's warmed up, now he's fresh. He clocks a certain time for 50 meters. So you take that time, that becomes your new standard, and now you measure 7% from that time, and then you add that 7% to the time, and that becomes your limit. So now you have your athlete who keeps sprinting and sprinting and sprinting and sprinting as long as he's maintaining that speed range that you've just determined with a drop-off. And then as soon as he does one rep that's below that new speed that you've calculated with that 7%, then you know that it's time to terminate that distance. It's either you move on to a different distance or you terminate the session, because now it just becomes garbage mileage and it becomes very ineffective. So that's the critical drop off. So it's just a measure that tells you that if you go past it, the training becomes non-effective or non-specific. So for hypertrophy purposes, for example, now the drop-off can be bigger because now we're talking more in a metabolic end type of quality. It's not as neural as relative strength or pure speed. So for hypertrophy, you can actually push the drop-off all the way to 20%. But again, for most of your athletes, because most athletes, it's about generating power, it's about speed, it's about neural potentiation. The 7% seems to be that sweet spot. Do I ever use full body workouts for hypertrophy? I don't. Personally, I find that with hypertrophy, the goal is to tap in a wide range of motor unit pool to create a lot of volume and stress on certain muscles. So for me to do full body session, the stress per workout given on a specific muscle is a little bit too low, and then the recovery ability from session to session to session to session when you're always doing full body becomes a little bit dampened, which really affect your true potential to build hypertrophy over time. So unless like you're a pure beginner, I think it's not the most effective way to build hypertrophy. And just empirically, I'm not just talking about my own personal observations and numbers and data from my clients, but even empirically, like you're not going to find a lot of successful like bodybuilders out there who use full body sessions. As always, I'm not saying that there's none, there's always outliers, but generally speaking, you're going to be hard pressed to find a high level bodybuilder who uses full body sessions. So sometimes it's not a bad thing to learn from people who have the experience and who've done it in the past. This can give you a lot of cues on how to maybe arrange or set up your training for hypertrophy. But again, generally speaking, I don't think that past the beginner level, many people are going to be able to succeed with high levels of hypertrophy doing full body sessions. So how do you load the weight using a paler descending rep scheme like 8-8-8-6-6? So these rep schemes, they're based on the law of repeated effort. So you're subjecting the central nervous system to recruiting the same motor unit pool with the same pathway on each and every set doing the same rep. So what's really important is that whatever weight you're doing for your sets of 8, you repeat that weight for the subsequent sets of 8. So 100 kilos for 8, 100 kilos for 8, 100 kilos for 8. Then you go up 5%, 105 kilo for 6, 105 kilo for 6. So it's not about step loading here. It's about repeating the same load for the exact same amount of reps to really leave a footprint, if you want, of that motor unit recruitment pattern so that you can learn to become stronger. So every time you see rep schemes like the Paler, just know that for every rep, you use the same weight from set to set, and then it's typically a 5% progression. 8 rep being 78%, 6 reps being 83% of your 1RM. That's a 5% difference. That's why you would go from 100 to 105 when you're changing bracket.